Technology of the Gods, The Incredible Sciences of the Ancients, by David Hatcher Childress. And here, my dear Watson, we come into those realms of conjecture where the most logical minds may be at fault. Each may form its own hypothesis upon the present evidence, and yours is as likely to be correct as mine. Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Empty House. From the moment I picked up your book until I laid it down, I was convulsed with laughter. Some day I intend reading it. Groucho Marx. All are architects of fate, working in these walls of time, some with massive deeds and great, some with lesser rhyme. Longfellow, The Builders. Preface. Believe me, that was a happy age, before the days of architects, before the days of builders. Seneca, 5 B.C. to 65 A.D. Epistle 90. Welcome to the controversial and fascinating world of ancient technology. In this book, we will explore the many bits of evidence that lead us to the astounding conclusion that ancient man was virtually as sophisticated as we are today. At least someone from somewhere was here using high technology. This technology included everything from electricity to heavy machinery and aircraft. The topics of ancient flight, ancient atomic wars, ancient electricity, and such will seem odd to many people, especially highly educated listeners. To many, these topics seem too incredible to even discuss, yet, as we shall see, there is a lot of evidence pointing to a technologically advanced past. Every culture in the world seems to have legends of ancient flight and a golden civilization before our own. Separating fact from fiction is the difficult part. A coherent timeline of the ancient past would also be helpful. Hopefully, new dating techniques, such as the chlorine-23 method, will accurately pinpoint when rock was hewn from its quarry and erected. Since the most ancient man-made artifacts are monuments in stone, this will give us information to accurately date the megalith masterminds and the dawn of their vanished civilization. As a reporter, I am interested in the strange and unusual. I am also interested in the facts. In this book I have tried to include those stories, artifacts, and places that seemed the most important, and could be largely verified. Admittedly, there is much speculation in this book, and I invite listeners to speculate as they will. Like all scientists, the listeners of this book will sift through the information presented, take that which seems reasonable to them, and file it in with their existing computer files to be accessed again later and modified as necessary. Other information they will discard and ignore. Throughout this book, a number of ancient texts are mentioned. Books that are mentioned by other authors within the text are referenced to the quoter's book. Special thanks to the Sanskrit scholar Ramchandra Dikshitar, the Oxford professor who wrote War in Ancient India. In a special chapter in the Oxford edition of his book, he waxed poetic over his country's contribution to aviation, inventing it. Said the proud historian back in 1944, "No question can be more interesting in the present circumstances of the world than India's contribution to the science of aeronautics. There are numerous illustrations in our vast Puranic and epic literature to show how well and wonderfully the ancient Indians conquered the air. To glibly characterize everything found in this literature as imaginary, and summarily dismiss it as unreal, has been the practice of both Western and Eastern scholars until very recently. The very idea, indeed, was ridiculed, and people went so far as to assert that it was physically impossible for man to use flying machines. But today, what with balloons, aeroplanes, and other flying machines, a great change has come over our ideas on the subject." Sadly, Dr. Dikshitar was indeed ridiculed by his fellow Oxford scholars at times, but the texts speak for themselves. What was a scientific-minded scholar to do? Ignore the evidence? Most did, in fact. In approaching the subject of advanced ancient technology, I have decided to start with simple but necessary technology such as irrigation, water, and sewage, and then move to the basic combination for advanced technology, metallurgy and electricity. With it established in the reader's mind that the ancients may well have had complicated metal machines and electricity, I then move on to the fantastic possibilities of ancient flight, atomic warfare, and the idea of a worldwide power system. Hey, it's a wild ride through ancient history, but it's my story and I'm sticking to it. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. 1. The enigma of ancient technology. As we acquire knowledge, things do not become more comprehensible, but more mysterious. Will Durant. I think, myself, that in 1903 we passed through the remains of a powdered world, left over from an ancient interplanetary dispute brooding in space. Charles Fort. Was the science of Egypt inherited from an earlier culture? In my searches for lost cities and mysteries of the past, I have often found clues to the technology of the ancients. These clues can be in the form of depictions of ancient devices in rock paintings or carvings, such as the electric devices at the Temple of Hathor in Egypt, or as small models of devices, such as the miniature solid gold airplanes at the Bogota Gold Museum, or in the stories from ancient texts, such as the Ramayana or even the Bible. In this book I would like to recap some of the evidence for ancient technology and for advanced ancient cultures in the past. What is amazing about the modern world versus the ancient one is that in the modern world, the average citizen has access to advanced technology such as electricity, a personal vehicle, telephone, fax, and computer technology. In the ancient world, high technology was largely denied the masses. In fact, it was often used in temples and ceremonies to gain power over people by amazing or terrifying them. This was part of worship and mystery. The well-known author and presenter of the television documentary Mystery of the Sphinx, John Anthony West, says, Egyptian science, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy were all of an exponentially higher order of refinement and sophistication than modern scholars will acknowledge. The whole of Egyptian civilization was based upon a complete and precise understanding of universal laws, and this profound understanding manifested itself in a consistent, coherent, and interrelated system that fused science, art, and religion into a single organic unity. In other words, it was exactly the opposite of what we find in the world today. Moreover, every aspect of Egyptian knowledge seems to have been complete at the very beginning. The sciences, artistic and architectural techniques, and the hieroglyphic system show virtually no signs of a period of development. Indeed, many of the achievements of the earliest dynasties were never surpassed, or even equaled later on. This astonishing fact is readily admitted by orthodox Egyptologists, but the magnitude of the mystery it poses is skillfully understated, while its many implications go unmentioned. How does a civilization spring full-blown into being? Look at a 1905 automobile and compare it to a modern one. There is no mistaking the process of development, but in Egypt there are no parallels. Everything is right there at the start. The answer to the mystery is of course obvious, but because it is repellent to the prevailing cast of modern thinking, it is seldom seriously considered. Egyptian civilization was not a development, but a legacy. In his highly rated NBC special of November 1993, Mystery of the Sphinx, West and his researchers sought to prove that the Sphinx had been severely water-worn and was over 10,000 years old. Why don't you write books people can read? Nora Joyce to her husband, James. The destruction of knowledge. As our technology has gotten more advanced, we have become able to look into the future and into outer space with a view different from that of scientists and thinkers earlier in this century. Similarly, we are now able to look at the past with greater insight and technological know-how. Just as our minds have been able to imagine a future different from that which our grandfathers could envision, we are also able to see a past different from that of the scientists and experts of the turn of the century. Just as our scope of the universe has been pushed back to the farthest reaches of space, we are now in a position to push back to the farthest reaches of history, and many researchers are doing just that. Atlantis, with its advanced culture, is named in ancient texts. To begin with, it is mentioned in Plato's dialogues, taken from ancient Egyptian records according to the text. And nearly every ancient culture in the world has myths and legends of an ancient world before and the cataclysm that destroyed it. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Hopis believed in the destruction of 4 or more worlds before our own. The destruction of Atlantis may not even be the most recent cataclysm to befall the earth. The most widely known books in the world, such as the Bible, the Mahabharata, the Quran, and even the Tao Te Ching, all speak of cataclysms and ancient civilizations that were destroyed. Ancient civilizations and stories about them filled thousands, even hundreds of thousands of volumes of books that were kept in libraries around the world in ancient times. Many ancient libraries were so huge that they were famous among local historians. The library at Alexandria is a well-known example. Sadly, it is a fact that throughout history, huge archives and libraries have been purposely destroyed. According to the famous astronomer Carl Sagan, a book entitled The True History of Mankind over the last 100,000 years once existed and was housed in the Great Library in Alexandria, Egypt. Unfortunately, this book, along with thousands of others, was burned by fanatical Christians in the 3rd century A.D. Any volumes which they might have missed were burned by the Muslims to heat baths a few hundred years later. All ancient Chinese texts were ordered destroyed in 212 B.C. by Emperor Shi Huangdi, the builder of the famous Great Wall. Vast amounts of ancient texts, virtually everything pertaining to history, philosophy, and science, were seized and burnt. Whole libraries, including the Royal Library, were destroyed. Some of the works of Confucius and Mencius were included in this destruction of knowledge. Fortunately, some books survived because people hid them in various underground caves, and many works were hidden in Taoist temples, where they are even now religiously kept and preserved. The Spanish conquistadors destroyed every Mayan codex that they found. Out of many thousands of Mayan books found by the Spanish, only 3 or 4 are known to exist today. Like the fanatical Christian sects of the 3rd century and Emperor Shi Huangdi in the 2nd century B.C., the conquistadors wanted to erase all knowledge of the past and the records that preserved it. Europe and the Mediterranean were plunged into the infamous Dark Ages when the Christian Church first split after a series of church councils, beginning with the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D. The last patriarch of the early Christian Church, Nestorius, was deposed at the Council of Ephesus in 431 A.D. He was banished to Libya, and the Nestorian Church moved eastward. The dispute concerned the early Christian doctrine of reincarnation and the idea that Christ had a dual nature. Jesus was a master, while Christ was the archangel Melchizedek. In the aftermath of this struggle, all books in the Byzantine Empire were ordered destroyed, except for a newly edited version of the Bible that the Catholic Church was issuing. The library at Alexandria was destroyed at this time, and the great mathematician and philosopher Hypatia was dragged from her chariot by a mob and torn to pieces. The mob went on to burn the library. Thus the suppression of science and knowledge, particularly of the ancient past, began in earnest. Knowledge has been suppressed throughout the last 2,000 years. It is sometimes said that history is written by the winners of wars rather than the losers. Given the amount of known war-oriented political propaganda still popular as history in this century, we should consider much of ancient history in this light. Given this suppression, it is astonishing that the few ancient texts that have survived do indeed speak of advanced civilizations and the cataclysms that destroyed them. Similarly, they talk of wise people who lived in harmony with the earth and the natural workings of all things. But at some time in the distant past, man fell out of harmony with nature, and a catastrophe struck the whole earth. We can determine a startling parallel between the ancient Atlantis myth and the situation that modern man now finds himself in. Will modern man survive his own technology and tribalism, or will he destroy himself in the natural workings of his destructive practices and disharmony with the earth? I have had a good many more uplifting thoughts, creative and expansive visions, while soaking in comfortable baths in well-equipped American bathrooms than I have ever had in any cathedral. Edmund Wilson. Ancient Sanitation. Bathrooms of the Gods. It has been said that the mark of any advanced civilization is the level of their sanitation and plumbing. Nice bathrooms and toilets are important conveniences. Plumbing and sanitation are themselves the offshoots of the science of irrigation, something that developed at least 25,000 years ago. Over 3,000 years ago, the Nabateans, an Arab people, maintained 6 flourishing cities in Israel's desolate Negev area, including the famous Petra. By utilizing an ingenious system of terraces and walls, these engineer farmers managed to till the soil on an average rainfall of 4 inches a year. The more one examines the Nabateans' elaborate systems, the more impressed he must be with the precision and scope of their work. They anticipated and solved every problem in a manner which we can hardly improve upon today. Some 3,000 years ago, the ancient Persians discovered a method of digging underground aqueducts that would bring mountain groundwater to their arid plains. Still extant and functional, the system of irrigation provides 75% of the water used in Iran today. For centuries, sanitary conditions in Europe were deplorable. The casual treatment of human waste sustained the horrible plagues that nearly decimated the continent on several occasions. But more than 5,000 years ago, in the Tigris Valley near Baghdad, Tel Asmar had homes and temples with elaborate arrangements for sanitation. One excavated temple had 6 toilets and 5 bathrooms, with most of the plumbing equipment connected to drains which discharged into a main sewer, 1 meter high and 50 meters long. In tracing one drain, the investigators came upon a line of earthenware pipes. One end of each section was about 8 inches in diameter, while the other end was reduced to 7 inches, so that the pipes could be coupled into each other just as is done with drain pipes in the 20th century. Ancient man made tunnels through mountains for irrigation purposes, and sometimes built massive dams or other large hydraulic engineering feats. The great dam built by the Queen of Sheba at Marib in Yemen is a good example. Huge hydraulic works of ancient man, hitherto unknown, are just coming to light. The Sri Lankan archaeologist A.D. Fernanado, in an article in the Journal of the Sri Lanka branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, 1982, relates the incredible discoveries made when Sri Lankan engineers wanted to place a dam at Maduru Oya, thereby drowning a large valley. As the bulldozers set to work, they began to scrape against bricks which already lay in the ground. To everybody's amazement, it turned out that prehistoric engineers had made the same calculations and had built a dam at the very same spot. Norwegian archaeologists visited the site and reported that the grandeur of these prehistoric megalithic waterworks would have impressed a pharaoh. Thor Heyerdahl says that much of the water system was constructed out of 15-ton blocks of stone 33 feet high and arranged in the shape of square tunnels and brick walls. The dams had sluices measuring more than 6 miles in length to control the water flow to a series of artificial lakes. Millions of tons of water had been regulated by this huge and sophisticated dam. It was thought by historians 100 years ago that since nomadic tribes had no formal bathrooms or sewage disposal, everyone must have lived that way. Nomadic tribes often packed up their tents and moved on when the garbage and sewage was just too much to take. Cities, however, are more difficult to just up and move. It was thought by early British archaeologists that ancient man did not use sophisticated sewage and water systems, mainly simply allowing rainwater to eventually wash away sewage into a nearby stream or river. However, many of the bathrooms of the ancient world were very luxurious, with colorful ceramic basins and bathtubs, just as we have today. Reginald Reynolds, in his witty book on ancient sanitation, cleanliness and godliness, argues that ancients knew about sewage disposal, but had 2 or more clearly separated systems. It is the opinion of Mr. Ernest Mackay, the eminent archaeologist, that these drains were not used for the disposal of sewage, and as evidence of this he cites us the Charaka Samhita, a work of the 2nd century A.D., as nearly as can be computed, in which it is said that latrines are intended only for the sick and infirm, and for the rest that a man should proceed a bow-shot from his house to do his business. The waters were suffered on occasion to run down the walls of the house, which he says would have been a noxious custom if these waters had contained sewage. But he omits to remind us that the contrary proposition, which is the absence of sewage disposal, would have been in a city even more noxious than an open drain, and since there were both open water chutes and closed drains in these houses, it were more reasonable to suppose that these two systems served separate purposes, the one to carry off rainwater and bath water, the other to dispose of sewage. But this at least is beyond dispute concerning those who inhabited the Mound of the Dead, Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, that they were possessed of well-appointed bathrooms, together with the system of drainage that I have described, as part of the sanitary vanguard of mankind. Sir G. Maspero, sometime Director-General of the Service of Antiquities in Egypt, spoke highly of the excellent hygienic and sanitary arrangements known in ancient Egypt, particularly of the elaborate bath discovered at Tel El Amarna, in the house of a high official of the 18th dynasty. And he observes that in the midst of their paved streets they provided a channel of stone to carry off water and drainage, and in this same bathroom at Tel El Amarna there was discovered a well-preserved closet behind a screen wall, this closet being provided with a seat of limestone, elegantly shaped. It was the opinion of Herodotus that the Egyptians were of all nations the most healthy, for he found them distinguished from other peoples by the singularity of their institutions and their manners. Reynolds tells us that the Egyptians also, like the Pythagoreans who imitated them, abstained from beans, which they held to be unclean, for which I can give no good explanation, though some say that Pythagoras was in this matter misunderstood by Aristotle. People were already avoiding beans 5,000 years ago. As to Egyptian toilets, Reynolds says that they preferred the composting type of toilets. They used earth rather than water for the most part. We have yet to see whether we are wiser than the pharaohs, for sanitation is not to be confused with any popular notion or prevalent system, but must be considered in relation to the best and most expeditious disposal of sewage, the abatement of nuisances and causes of infection, the fertility of the soil, and many other matters, such as the climate and the means at human disposal. But we know from these general observations that the priest-physicians who directed the public hygiene of Egypt found cleanliness next to godliness, and were concerned to keep at least the upper-class quarters of their cities wholesome. The Egyptians knew even the art of making drains of hammered copper, of which one was found fully 450 yards in length at the Temple of Sahara, though this drain served only for rainwater, and that their supply of water was considered a matter of great importance for the attention of the highest officer of the state, we know from an inscription concerning the duties of the vizier under the 18th dynasty. For this inscription says of the vizier, "It is he who dispatches the official staff to attend to the water supply in the whole land." And again the inscription reads that, "It is he who inspects the water supply on the first of every 10-day period." William Corliss reports in his Science Frontiers newsletter that the ancient Egyptians not only had advanced toilets and bathrooms, but also applied cosmetics copiously to themselves. Upper-class women, as well as many men, favored green, white, and black makeup. These cosmetic powders, dating from 2000 B.C., have been exceptionally well preserved in their original vials made of alabaster, wood, or ceramic. A team of French chemists, led by P. Voltaire, was not surprised when their analyses of these powders found crushed galena and cerussite, 2 ores of lead. However, they nearly dropped their test tubes when they also found chemical compounds that are extremely rare in nature, specifically laurionite and phosgenite. In fact, these compounds are so rare naturally that the Egyptian powders must be artificial. P. Voltaire et al. wrote, Taken together, these results indicate that laurionite and phosgenite must have been synthesized in ancient Egypt using wet chemistry. The Egyptians manufactured artificial lead-based compounds and added them to the cosmetic product. The underlying chemical reactions are simple, but the whole process, including many repetitive operations, must have been quite difficult to achieve. It had been recognized earlier that the Egyptian chemists had used fire-based technology 500 years earlier in 2500 BC to manufacture blue pigment. Wet chemistry represented another forward technological step. Corliss comments that, uncowed by the successes of the ancient Egyptian chemists, those in Nisan have synthesized artificial bird droppings for use in testing automobile paints. The real stuff, you see, is inconsistent from batch to batch. Quality bathrooms need good soap, and the very word soap comes down to us from the ancient Egyptian word, swab. In 1931, the British Egyptologist Dr. Rendell Harris maintained that the words swab and swabber derive from the Egyptian language and are of the greatest antiquity. WDB, he says, among the ancient Egyptians, signified pure, and from this word he would trace the name of the Wahhabis, who are the Puritans of Islam today. Also, he says the letter S expresses causation, so that Ankh, being the word meaning life, S-Ankh signifies to make alive. From this he concludes that, if WDB be pure, SWDB would be to make pure, that is to say, to cleanse or to swab. And since it was among the opinions strongly held by Dr. Harris that the Egyptians were a great seafaring people, he contends that this word swab came into our language through the ancient intercourse of seamen, whose language may be in parts older than any now spoken in Europe. For the seafaring use of the word he invokes Shakespeare, who wrote of the master, the swabber, the boatswain, and I. The seafaring skills of the Egyptians were considerable, and it is beyond dispute that they had great fleets of ships. Apparently, swabbing the deck comes from ancient Egyptian, and our word soap is derived from swab, that which makes clean. Proper hygiene, sanitary water, soaps, and sewage disposal are all necessary for any technological civilization to advance forward. When it comes to the technology of the gods, cleanliness is next to godliness. Many of today's inventions were yesterday's inventions. The ancient Greeks built steam boilers that worked, but they used them only as gadgets and toys, rather than as practical sources of power. One such toy was a sphere that was spun by two steam jets, and was invented in Ptolemaic Greek Egypt circa 200 BC. Also, in the 2nd century before the Christian era, Egyptian temples had slot machines for holy water. The quantity of water which flowed from the tap was in direct relation to the weight of the coin thrown into the slot. The Temple of Zeus in Athens had a similar, automatically controlled holy water dispenser. A coin was dropped into a sealed vessel which made a small plunger pull up, which then allowed a measured quantity of fluid to be dispensed. The famous Greek-Egyptian inventor Hero of Alexandria invented one such well-known device in 120 BC. It is evident from this example that temples and priests were involved in technology at an early time. Many of the common inventions of the modern world, steam engines, clocks, vending machines, hydraulic pumps, etc., were all known in the ancient world. Finely made instruments and tools, such as the Antikythera device, to be discussed later, were common in ancient times, but archaeologists are always surprised to discover them. Gynecology was an unknown science until the latter half of the 19th century. Then, according to the October 20th, 1900 issue of Scientific American, excavations at Pompeii revealed gynecology to be but a reinvention in the world of surgery. Instruments buried in the Temple of Vestal Virgins since the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79 were found to demonstrate that gynecology was a science flourishing in its perfection long before that date. In every instance, the instruments are almost in their minutest particulars exact duplicates of those in use by the most approved modern science of today. The workmanship is as fine as anything to be produced in this line in the 20th century. The instruments are hand-wrought, the screws as thread-like and capable of delicate manipulation as anything to be found in today's achievements. Shipwrecks around the Mediterranean give us an idea of the machines that the ancient Greeks, Romans, and other Mediterranean maritime cultures possessed. The July 27, 1959 issue of Chemical Engineering had an article about an 80-pound valve that had been salvaged from one of Emperor Caligula's yachts. The valve was made of a zinc-free, lead-rich, anti-corrosion, anti-friction bronze. Said the article, "The Caligula valve was found submerged at the bottom of Lake Nemi in Rome. Although 19 centuries old, it still exhibits highly polished surfaces and retains its plug tightly." While modern fashion and sexual trends may simply mimic those of ancient times, scientists are too often surprised at the high level of technical and scientific knowledge of ancient man. Becoming familiar with ancient science is a good start for the layman, and two good books that are easily obtainable are Technology in the Ancient World by Henry Hodges and Engineering in the Ancient World by J. Landells. With these books, the science of classical times can be seen to be very similar to our own. If we human beings want to feel humility, there is no need to look at the starred infinity above. It suffices to turn our gaze upon the world cultures that existed thousands of years before us, achieved greatness before us, and perished before us. C. W. Seyram, Gods, Graves, and Scholars. The Amazing Inventions of China. Many ancient inventions are said to have originated in China, though many of them probably came from even earlier cultures. The Chinese possessed geared machinery from an early age, some think as far back as the early centuries B.C., if not before. While modern historians prefer to trace China back only to the Zhou dynasty in 1122 B.C., the Chinese themselves trace their history back to the semi-mythical 5 monarchs. Extant Chinese texts state that the first of the dynasties was that of the 5 monarchs, in which there were, confusingly, 9 rulers whose combined reigns lasted from 2852 to 2206 B.C. Confucius ascribed to one king, Yao, whose reign started around 2357 B.C., kindliness, wisdom, and sense of duty. He was succeeded by Shun, who built a vast network of roads, passes, and bridges through the enormous land, and many scholars attribute the building of the Silk Road to him. All ancient Chinese texts, especially those of Lao Tzu and Confucius, as well as the I Ching, speak of the ancients and the glory of their civilization. They were presumably speaking about the people living at least at the time of the 5 monarchs, and probably before. The legendary Qigong people of this early period were said to have flying carriages. As noted before, just before he died in 212 B.C., Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi ordered that all the books and literature relating to ancient China be destroyed. Vast amounts of ancient texts, virtually everything pertaining to history, astronomy, philosophy, and science, were seized and burnt. Whole libraries, including the Royal Library, were destroyed. Some of the works of Confucius and Mencius were included in this destruction of knowledge. Fortunately, some books survived, as people hid them, and many works were hidden in Taoist temples, where they are even now religiously kept and preserved. They are on no account shown to anyone, but kept hidden away as they have been for thousands of years. The persecution and closing of religious temples by the communists indicated that the lamas still had cause to keep their ancient books hidden. Doubtless, there was a great deal of lost history relating to the early days of China and its technology. What caused the Emperor Qin to want to destroy any record of the past just prior to his death? Was he such a megalomaniac that he wanted history to start with him, or was he influenced by the same evil forces that inspired Genghis Khan and Hitler to the same sort of book-burning? We have heard that in the remote past, kings had titles but no posthumous appellations. In recent times, kings not only had titles, but after their death were awarded names based on their conduct. That means sons passed judgment on their fathers, subjects on their sovereign. This cannot be allowed. Posthumous titles are herewith abolished. We are the first emperor, and our successors shall be known as the second emperor, the third emperor, and so on for endless generations. Qin Shi Huangdi, Edict, 212 B.C. Despite their sometimes despotic rulers, invention and innovation thrived in ancient China and Central Asia. It was really the Chinese who invented movable type. The inventor was a fellow named Bi Sheng who introduced the technology in 1045 A.D., 400 years before Gutenberg first printed the Bible. The Chinese are also credited with inventing writing paper, wrapping paper, paper napkins, playing cards, and paper money. Toilet paper was another one of the spin-offs of their paper industry, over 2,000 years ago. Probably all of these inventions had existed in their past and more. The Chinese were well aware of earthquakes and geological changes. They developed earthquake-resistant houses as long as 7,000 years ago. The world's first known seismograph for detecting and recording faraway earthquakes was invented by Zhang Heng in 132 A.D. This ingenious device stood about 8 feet tall and featured 8 bronze dragons holding balls between their jaws. When tilted by a distant earthquake, an internal pendulum opened the jaw of the dragon facing the source of the tremor, and the ball dropped into the mouth of a bronze frog waiting below each dragon. The first mechanical clock is attributed to 2 Chinese inventors around 725 A.D., and gunpowder was known in China at least as early as the 9th century, if not much earlier. Used there only for fireworks and enjoyment, after it was first brought to Europe in the 13th century, it fueled the first cannons, which were made by the Dutch and Germans. The Chinese have always had great scope and vision regarding their projects. Not only was the Great Wall a colossal endeavor, but the Grand Canal of China, which connects the Yellow River with the Yangtze, is 20 times longer than the Panama Canal. Yet the Chinese constructed it without modern equipment starting over 1,300 years ago. There are other mammoth projects that still are largely unknown or waiting to be discovered, such as the largest pyramid in the world near Xi'an. Even the Chinese version of the typewriter, called the Huang typewriter, has 5,700 characters on a keyboard 2 feet wide and 17 inches high. In The Genius of China, 3,000 Years of Science, Discovery, and Invention, the author Robert Temple, distilling the book from Joseph Needham's works at Cambridge University, says that the Chinese knew and used poison gas and tear gas in the 4th century B.C., 2,300 years before the West got around to it. The Chinese were making cast iron in the 4th century B.C., 1,700 years before the West, and they manufactured steel from cast iron in the 2nd century B.C., 2,000 years before the West. The first suspension bridge was built in China in the 1st century, at least 1,800 years before the West, and the Chinese invented matches in 577, 1,000 years before the West. Says Needham in the introduction of the book about the advanced level of civilization in China, first, why should they have been so far in advance of other civilizations? And second, why aren't they now centuries ahead of the rest of the world? Perhaps China inherited its knowledge from an older civilization. Its discoveries, like ours, are just the rediscovery of an ancient technology from the roller coaster ride of history. Says author Andrew Thomas in his book We Are Not the First, cybernetics is an old science. In China it was known as the art of Kuai Shu, by means of which a statue was brought to life to serve its maker. The description of a mechanical man is contained in the story of Emperor Tachuan. The Empress found the robot so irresistible that the jealous ruler of the Celestial Empire gave orders to the constructor to break it up, in spite of all the admiration that he himself had for the walking robot. One of the world's first calculating machines was, of course, the 2,600-year-old Chinese abacus. It is only recently that modern calculators made faster calculations than the simple but efficient abacus. This would seem fantastic. One would think that modern engineers had exploited these forces to the nth degree, but the truth is that outside the common ram or turbine, the ancients can teach us a thing or two. Jules Verne, in reply to a statement that the exploitation of natural forces had been exhausted. The Marvelous Chinese Clocks. The marvelous clocks of ancient China are a good example of how complicated ancient machinery could be. Although mechanical clocks have been around for thousands of years, the problem of accuracy over extended periods of weeks and months was difficult to solve. The Chinese solved this problem with a device called an escapement. This mechanism makes it possible to closely regulate the speed of a clock and to drive it with a comparatively small power source. The first known clock with an escapement was built about 724 AD by Liang Lingzan, though it seems that the technology was known before then. This apparatus included a celestial sphere that turned with the heavens, a model sun and moon that went around the sphere as the real ones seemed to do about the earth, and jacks that struck bells and beat drums to mark the passage of time. The bell of Liang's clock marked the Chinese hour, or shi, which is twice the length of one of ours. The drum sounded a shorter period, the ko. This is 1/100th of a solar day, or 14 minutes and 24 seconds on our time scale. Like more westerly peoples, the Chinese originally divided day and night into intervals, which stretched and shrank with the seasons. Later, about 1100 AD, the Chinese adopted a system of equal permanent periods that stayed the same regardless of the wanderings of dawn and sunset. This change made clockmaking easier. In Liang's clock, water, flowing into scoops, turned a wheel automatically, rotating it one complete revolution in one day and night. The machinery of the clock included wheels and shafts, hooks, pins, and interlocking rods, mopping devices, and locks checking mutually. The words pins and interlocking rods describe the escapement, which was needed to make the wheel revolve so slowly. The escapement was presumably a simple system of tripping lugs that held the water wheel against rotation until one scoop had been filled, and then allowed it to move only far enough to bring the next scoop into the filling position. Liang's clock kept better time than anything seen before, although it would no doubt have seemed impossibly inaccurate by our standards. After Liang's time, corrosion of the parts of bronze and iron put the clock out of action, and it was retired to a museum. Later, mechanicians built grander clocks. In 976 AD, Zhang Szun built a clock that occupied a pagoda-like tower over 30 feet high. This had 19 jacks, which not only rang bells and beat drums, but also popped out of little doors holding signs to show the time. Other parts showed the movements of the heavens, the sun, the moon, and the planets. To keep his clock from being stopped by the freezing of the water in winter, Zhang rebuilt it to use mercury instead of water as the working fluid. According to L. Sprague de Camp in his book The Ancient Engineers, the grandest of these imperial water clocks was built by Su Song in 1090. Su Song's memorial to the emperor Shenzong describes his clock with diagrams, so that if anybody wished to do so, he could reconstruct the clock with fair accuracy today. At this time, the Sung dynasty ruled most of China, though a nomad tribe, the Khitans, had conquered some of the northern provinces. Su Sung had a long career in the imperial bureaucracy. His eventual list of titles included official of the second titular rank, president of the Ministry of Personnel, imperial tutor to the crown prince, grand protector of the army, and Kaiguo Marquis of Wugung. When Su was sent on a mission to the Khitan court to congratulate the Khan on having passed the winter solstice, he found that he had arrived a day too early. The Sung astronomers had erred by a quarter hour in calculating the exact time of the solstice. Su saved his sovereign's face, and probably his own, by lecturing on the difficulty of exactly calculating such events. But when Su returned to the Sung capital of Kaifeng, he urged the emperor to let him build a clock accurate enough to avoid such contretemps. Receiving approval, Su, like any competent engineer, built a couple of wooden pilot models, one small and one full-sized, to get the bugs out of the design before tackling the final clock. The finished machine occupied a tower at least 35 feet high, counting the penthouse on top. Water flowing through a series of vessels filled the 36 scoops of a water wheel, one after the other. An escapement allowed the wheel to rotate, one scoop interval at a time. The wheel revolved once in 9 hours, while the water fell from the scoops into a basin below the wheel. The wheel turned a wooden shaft in iron bearings. This shaft, by means of a crown gear, turned a long vertical shaft that worked all the rest of the machinery, to which it was connected by gearing. The machinery included an armillary sphere, a set of graduated intersecting rings corresponding to the horizon, the ecliptic, and the meridian, in the penthouse on top. There was also a celestial sphere, with pearls for stars in the top story, and 5 large horizontal wheels bearing jacks. Altogether, Sue's clock must have been an impressive spectacle, what with the continual splashing, the clatter of the escapement, the creak of the shafts in their bearings, and the frequent outbursts of drums, bells, and gongs. One shortcoming of the clock was that it was not so placed that a natural source of water could power it. Hence it had to be wound up from time to time. This was accomplished by hand-turned water wheels, which raised the water from the basin, into which it cascaded from the scoops of the main water wheel to the reservoir above this wheel. About 1126 A.D., a Tatar people, the Jurchens, whose kings reigned under the dynastic name of Jin, conquered the Khitan lands and some Sung provinces as well. After capturing Kaifeng, they carried away, to their own capital of Peking, Sue's clock, together with mechanics to run it. The captive horologists built a new tower and succeeded in making the clock run, after they had adjusted its astronomical parts for the change of latitude. After a few years, though, the parts wore out, the clock stopped, and lightning wrecked the upper part of the tower. The Jin emperors left the remains of the clock behind when they fled before the Mongols in 1260, and it disappeared. Meanwhile, the Sung emperors wanted another imperial clock, but Susung was dead, and nobody could be found who knew the subject well enough to build such a complicated mechanism. Similar clocks continued to be built under the Mongol or Yuan dynasty. The last Yuan emperor made a hobby of mechanical engineering and took part in the construction of tail-wagging dragons and other automata. But when the Ming overthrew the Yuan in 1368, all the clocks, mechanical dragons, and other machines built for the Mongol emperors were scrapped as useless extravagances. The modern clock device, from which such devices as grandfather clocks and pocket watches are derived, is generally traced to the year 1364, when Giovanni di Dondi, of an Italian clock-making family, published a description of a weight-powered, escapement-regulated clock which, except for improvements in detail, is essentially a modern clock. Dondi became famous, and astronomers came from foreign lands to look at his marvelous clock. Galileo later substituted a pendulum for Dondi's crown-shaped balance wheel, but in watches and small clocks we still use Dondi's device. Sometime around 1502, Peter Henlein of Nuremberg invented the spring-driven watch, so called because it was originally used by watchmen. Henlein's Nuremberg egg was slightly larger than a modern alarm clock, had a single hand, and hung from a chain around the neck. Early watches gave their owners much difficulty. As Maximilian I of Bavaria used to say, "If you want troubles, buy a watch." Watches, and clocks in general, have probably been giving mankind trouble for thousands of years. The Curious Crystal Skull. Part of the enigma of ancient technology are oddball objects or devices which are clearly artificial, yet how they could have been made baffles scientists. One such curious object is the famous Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, found in the ruins of the ancient city Lubantun in what is today Belize. Lubantun means place of fallen stones in the local Mayan dialect, and the actual name of the city remains unknown. Lubantun was first reported to the British colonial government late in the last century by the inhabitants of the Toledo settlement near Punta Gorda, and in 1903 the governor of the colony commissioned Thomas Gann to investigate it. Gann explored and excavated the main structures around the central plaza, and concluded that the site's population must have been large. His report was published in England in 1904. In 1915, R. E. Merwin of Harvard University investigated the site, locating many more structures, recognizing a ball court, and drawing the first plan. His excavation of the ball court revealed 3 carved stone markers, each depicting 2 men playing the ball game. Curiously, these are the only carved stones found at Lubantun. It wasn't until 1924 that F.A. Mike Mitchell Hedges arrived at Lubantun to help Thomas Gann with the excavation of the city. In 1927, while digging in a collapsed altar and adjoining wall, Mitchell Hedges's adopted daughter, Anna, discovered the life-size crystal skull on her 17th birthday. 3 months later, a matching jawbone was discovered 25 feet from the altar, and thus one of the world's strangest ancient objects came to popular attention. The age of the skull is unknown. Rock crystal cannot be dated by conventional means. Hewlett-Packard Laboratories, which studied the skull, estimated that its completion would have required a minimum of 300 years' work by a series of extremely gifted artisans. On the hardness scale, rock crystal ranks only slightly below diamonds. The mystery of the skull deepened when it was discovered that the jawbone was carved from the same piece of crystal, and that when the 2 pieces were attached, the cranium rocked on the jawbone base, giving the impression that the skull was talking by opening and closing its mouth. In this manner the skull could have been manipulated as a temple oracle by priests. Even more incredible properties are ascribed to the skull. The frontal lobe is said to cloud over sometimes, turning milky white. At other times the skull is said to emit an aura of light, strong with a faint trace of the color of hay, similar to a ring around the moon. According to Frank Dorland, a crystallographer for Hewlett-Packard who studied the skull for years, the skull's eyes would sometimes flicker as if they were alive, and observers have reported strange sounds, odors, and various light effects emanating from the skull. Bizarre photographs have been taken of pictures which sometimes form within the skull. An example of such pictures forming within the skull are images of flying discs, UFO flying saucers, and of what appears to be the Caracol Observatory at the Toltec Mayan site of Chichen Itza. In the past few years the skull has become quite famous because it has been displayed at psychic fairs in the USA and Canada. The skull now resides with Anna Sammy Mitchell Hedges in Kitchener, Ontario, or at her other home in the south of England. F.A. Mitchell Hedges was a fascinating person, and in some ways his life was very much a model for an Indiana Jones sort of character. Born in 1882, Mike Mitchell Hedges was destined for a life of adventure. He chronicles many of his adventures in his book, Danger, My Ally, which was published in 1954. Mitchell Hedges came to Canada and the United States in 1899, met with J.P. Morgan, won a fortune in a card game, and took off for Mexico. He was then captured and held prisoner by Pancho Villa, and later rode with Villa in northern Mexico. He eventually ended up in Central America. With his girlfriend, the wealthy Lady Richmond Brown, who was married at the time, he cruised the Caribbean, exploring the Bay Islands off Honduras, the San Blas Islands off Panama, and the area around Jamaica. He believed that artifacts which he had found in the Bay Islands pointed to a high civilization that was now beneath the water, and equated it with Atlantis. Mitchell Hedges had a penchant for mystical sciences and secret societies, and championed the cause of lost civilizations and Atlantis. Eventually he ended up in Lubantun, and the crystal was discovered in 1927. Curiously, he devotes only 3 paragraphs to the famous crystal skull. Ancient societies were primitive, yet we know that ancient steam engines, cog-wheeled clocks, and crystal skulls existed. What other secrets of high technology does the past have for us? The skull of doom is made of pure rock crystal, and according to scientists it must have taken over 150 years, generation after generation working all the days of their lives, patiently rubbing down with sand an immense block of rock crystal, until finally the perfect skull emerged. It is at least 3,600 years old, and according to legend was used by the high priest of the Maya when performing esoteric rites. It is said that when he willed death with the help of the skull, death invariably followed. It has been described as the embodiment of all evil. I do not wish to try and explain this phenomena. Today the skull continues to amaze audiences around the world and is frequently on television. Quartz crystals are today used in the highest forms of technology as well, as in computers and LCD watches. The crystal skull, like other objects, is apparently a high-tech object from the past. The enigma of ancient technology is that we believe that the ancient societies were primitive, yet we know that ancient steam engines, cog-wheeled clocks, and crystal skulls existed. What other secrets of high technology does the past have for us? 2. The megalith masterminds. Facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. Aldous Huxley. Truth is one, but error proliferates. Man tracks it down and cuts it up into little pieces, hoping to turn it into the grains of truth. René Daumont, The Way of the Truth. Megalithomania. Legends of resplendent ancient civilizations and their cataclysmic destruction are part of nearly every culture in the world. The modern skeptic asks, well, if highly advanced ancient societies existed in the past, then where is the evidence of their machinery and such, and shouldn't there be the remains of these people's cities? The answer is that such evidence does exist, and hundreds of ruined cities have been found, both above and below water. The idea that man was primitive in the past and that the present represents the highest civilization our planet has achieved is fairly well accepted in the West, while other cultures view history as cyclical and see our current society as a decline from a former golden age. Out of the past we find megalithic cities built to last for thousands of years. How primitive must we suppose these people were? Throughout the world there exists a type of megalithic construction that is called Atlantean by those researchers who believe in advanced civilizations of the past. This is typically a type of construction which used gigantic blocks of stone, often crystalline granite. Huge blocks are fitted together without mortar in a polygonal style which tends to interlock the heavy blocks in a jigsaw fashion. These interlocked polygonal walls resist earthquake damage by moving with the shock wave of the quake. They momentarily jumble themselves and move freely, but then fall back into place. These interlocked jigsaw walls will not collapse with an earthquake shock wave, as with brick wall construction. Such Atlantean-style construction can be found all over the world. Classical examples of such construction are at Mycenae in the Peloponnese and the temples of Malta, along with the gigantic megalithic walls of Tiahuanaco, Ollantaytambo, Monte Alban, and Stonehenge, as well as the pre-Egyptian structures of the Osirion at Abydos and the Valley Temple of the Sphinx. Atlantean architecture is often circular and uses the most exact rock-cutting techniques to fit blocks together. Atlantean-type architecture often uses keystone cuts. Identical shapes are cut into rock on both sides of a joint, and the space is fitted with a metal clamp. These keystone cuts are typically an hourglass shape or a double T shape. The clamps that went inside them may have been copper, bronze, silver, electrum, a mixture of silver and gold, or some other metal. In nearly every case where keystone cuts can be found, the metal clamp has already been removed, many thousands of years ago. Many well-known and not-so-well-known ruins of the world contain the remains of even earlier cities within them. Such sites as Baalbek in Lebanon, Cuzco in Peru, the Acropolis of Athens, Lixus in Morocco, Cadiz in Spain, and even the Temple Mount of Jerusalem are built on gigantic remains of earlier ruins. Some modern cities, Cuzco is a good example, contain 3 or more levels of occupation, including modern occupants. Some archaeologists think the civilization that these earlier buildings are from is the mythical civilization of Atlantis. Where then is Atlantis? Atlantis is all around us, asserted British scholar John Mitchell in his book The View Over Atlantis. Mitchell further showed that amazing ancient ruins are a worldwide phenomenon in his Megalithomania. Many authors have attempted to show how the worldwide distribution of megaliths points to an advanced civilization in an antediluvian sense, including such scholarly works as Megaliths and Masterminds by Peter Lancaster Brown. Their thesis was that the ancient world was remarkably advanced for its so-called Stone Age inheritance, and they argued that an advanced civilization called Atlantis preceded the dawn of history. The prehistoric civilization not only ranged worldwide, but built impressive monuments and buildings as well. The idea that man has only recently invented such things as electricity, generators, steam and combustion engines, or even powered flight, does not necessarily hold true for a world that rides the roller coaster of history. Indeed, when we see how quickly inventions are absorbed into today's society, we can imagine how quickly a highly scientific civilization may have arisen in remote antiquity. Just as today there are still primitive tribes in New Guinea and South America who live a Stone Age existence, so could Atlantis have existed during a period where other areas of the world lived in various stages of development. The ancient world of Atlantis may have been a lot like the modern world of today. Juxtaposed between various factions in the government and military, while international discontent rises in various client colonies of an economic system set up by large business interests. According to the mythos that is built up around Atlantis, it was destroyed because of the wars that it had fought around the world. Today the world is again teetering on the brink of wholesale Armageddon because of political, religious, and ethnic differences. Does modern man have something to gain by studying the past? Students of Atlantis believe so. The Osirian Civilization. The Osirian civilization, according to esoteric tradition, was an advanced civilization contemporary with Atlantis. In the world of about 15,000 years ago, there were a number of highly developed and sophisticated civilizations on our planet, each said to have a high degree of technology. Among these fabled civilizations was Atlantis, while another highly developed civilization existed in India. This civilization is often called the Rama Empire. What is theorized is a past quite different from that which we have learned in school. It is a past with magnificent cities, ancient roads and trade routes, busy ports and adventurous traders and mariners. Much of the ancient world was civilized, and such areas of the world as ancient India, China, Peru, Mexico, and Osiris were thriving commercial centers, with many important cities. Many of these cities are permanently lost forever, but others have been or will be discovered. It is said that at the time of Atlantis and Rama the Mediterranean was a large and fertile valley, rather than a sea as it is today. The Nile River came out of Africa as it does today and was called the River Styx. However, instead of flowing into the Mediterranean Sea at the Nile Delta in northern Egypt, it continued into the valley, and then turned westward to flow into a series of lakes to the south of Crete. The river flowed out between Malta and Sicily, south of Sardinia, and then into the Atlantic at Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules. This huge fertile valley, along with the Sahara, then a vast fertile plain, was known in ancient times as the Osirian civilization. The Osirian civilization could also be called pre-dynastic Egypt, the ancient Egypt that built the Sphinx and pre-Egyptian megaliths, such as the Osirian at Abydos. In this outline of ancient history it was the Osirian Empire that was invaded by Atlantis, and devastating wars raged throughout the world toward the end of the period of Atlantis's warlike imperial expansion. Solon relates in Plato's dialogues that Atlantis, just near the cataclysmic end, invaded ancient Greece. This ancient Greece was one that the ancient Greeks knew nothing about. This unknown ancient Greece, as we shall see, is closely connected to the Osiris-Isis civilization. The story of Osiris himself, as related by the Greek historian Plutarch, is revealing in technology. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was born of the earth and sky, was the first king of Egypt and the instrument of its civilization. Osiris allegedly traveled throughout the world, teaching the arts of civilization after the flood. He weaned the inhabitants of Egypt from their barbarous ways, taught agriculture, formulated laws, and taught the worship of the gods. Having accomplished this, he set off to impart his knowledge to the rest of the world. During his absence, his wife Isis ruled, but Osiris's brother and her brother-in-law, Typhon, also known as Set and known to us as Satan, was always ready to disrupt her work. When Osiris returned from civilizing the world, or attempting to, at least, Set, Typhon, Satan decided he would kill Osiris and take Isis for himself. He collected 72 conspirators to his plot, and had a beautiful chest made to the exact measurements of Osiris. He threw a banquet, and declared that he would give the chest to whomever could lie comfortably within it. When Osiris got in, the conspirators rushed to the chest and fastened the lid with nails. They then poured lead over the box and dumped it into the river, where it was carried out to sea. When Isis heard of Osiris's death, she immediately set out to find her beloved. The box with Osiris in it came aground at Byblos in present-day Lebanon, not too far from the massive slabs at Baalbek. A tree grew around the box where it landed, and the king of Byblos had it cut down and used it as a pillar in his palace, Osiris still being inside. Isis eventually located Osiris and brought him back to Egypt, where Typhon, Set, Satan, broke into the box, chopped Osiris into 14 different pieces, and scattered him about the countryside. The loving Isis went looking for the pieces of her husband, and each time she found a piece, she buried it, which is why there are temples dedicated to Osiris all over Egypt, and apparently other parts of the eastern Mediterranean as well. In another version, she only pretends to bury the pieces in an attempt to fool Set, Typhon, and puts Osiris back together, bringing him back to life. Eventually she found all the pieces, except the phallus, and Osiris, one way or another, returned from the underworld and encouraged his son Horus, the familiar hawk-headed god, to avenge his death. Scenes in Egyptian temples frequently depict the hawk-headed Horus spearing a great serpent, Typhon or Set, in a scene that is identical to that of St. George and the Dragon, though depicted thousands of years earlier. In the happy ending, Isis and Osiris get back together and have another child, Harpocrates. However, he is born prematurely and is lame in the lower legs as a result. There are many important themes in the legend of Osiris, including resurrection and the vanquishing of evil by good, and perhaps a key to the ancient Osirian civilization. Were the 14 scattered pieces of Osiris an allusion to 14 sacred sites built by the Osirians throughout the Mediterranean? I have already mentioned the theory that the Mediterranean was once a fertile valley with many cities, farms, and temples. Perhaps some of the 14 sites lie still undetected underwater, and others are known, but their full importance has not been identified. I believe that the early megalithic construction at Baalbek, Jerusalem, Giza, and the Osirian at Abydos would count as known sites among the number. A key to the megalithic society of Osiris can be found in the curious buried ruins of the Osirian, the megalithic pre-dynastic ruins at Abydos in southern Egypt. The British archaeologist Naville noted in a London Illustrated News article in 1914 that here and there on the huge granite blocks was a thick knob, which was used for moving the stones. The blocks are very large, a length of 15 feet is by no means rare, and the whole structure has decidedly the character of the primitive construction which in Greece is called Cyclopean, an Egyptian example of which is at Giza, the so-called Temple of the Sphinx. Naville is directly relating the Osirian to the gigantic and prehistoric construction in Greece, and also to the Temple of the Sphinx. Other such sites around the former Osirian Empire are on the island of Malta, in Lebanon, in Israel, the Balearic Islands, and other areas of the Mediterranean. In fact, virtually every Mediterranean island of any size has prehistoric megaliths on it. Furthermore, the knobs, which may or may not be for moving the stones, are the same sort of knobs that occur on the gigantic stones that are used on the massive walls to be found in the vicinity of Cuzco, Peru. The lack of inscriptions indicates that the Osirian, like the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, was built before the use of hieroglyphics in Egypt. We know this because the Egyptians always engraved hieroglyphics and decorations into any of their architecture. The only exceptions are those buildings, such as Great Pyramid, the Osirian, and the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, that are thought by many archaeologists now to be older than other structures. The Osirian is evidently a relic from the civilization of Osiris itself. The present and the past are perhaps both present in the future, and the future is contained in the past. T.S. Eliot. Baalbek and Osiris. One of the most astonishing ancient ruins in the world is the megalithic base of Baalbek, the pre-Roman ruins upon which a Roman-era temple sits. The archaeological site of Baalbek is 44 miles east of Beirut and consists of a number of ruins and catacombs. 2,500 feet long on each side, it is one of the largest stone structures in the world. A portion of it consists of gigantic cut stone blocks from some ancient time, forming a platform with a Roman temple built on top of it. The Roman temple to Jupiter and Venus was built on top of the earlier temples, dedicated to the corresponding ancient deities, Baal and his partner, the goddess Astarte. The temples to Baal and Astarte may initially have been built as part of a prehistoric sun temple, and even then on the ruins of the more ancient structure, its purpose unknown. According to an article by Jim Tyson in the Info Journal, the Greeks called the temple Heliopolis, which means sun temple or sun city. Even so, the original purpose of the gigantic platform may have been something else entirely. Baalbek is a good example of what happens to large, well-made ancient walls. They are used again and again by other builders who erect a new city or temple on top of the older one, using the handy stones that are already to be found at the site. Often the original stones are so colossal that they could not be moved and placed elsewhere anyway. This is exactly what has been going on at many sites, in the Old World and in the Americas. Examples of very ancient stonework, 3,000 to 6,000 years old, mixed with more recent ancient stonework, 500 to 2,500 years ago, can be seen at Monte Alban in Mexico, and at such Andean sites as Chavin, Cuzco, and Ollantaytambo. At Baalbek, the Roman architecture, largely destroyed by an earthquake in 1759, does not pose any archaeological problems, but the massive cut stone blocks beneath it certainly do. One part of the enclosure wall, called the Trilithon, is composed of 3 blocks of hewn stone that are the largest stone blocks ever used in construction on this planet, so far as is known. Underwater ruins may reveal larger constructions. This is an engineering feat that has never been equaled in history. The weight and even size of the stones is open to controversy. According to the author René Norbergen in his fascinating book Secrets of the Lost Races, the individual stones are 82 feet long and 15 feet thick, and are estimated to weigh between 1,200 and 1,500 tons each. A ton is 2,000 pounds, which would make the blocks weigh an estimated 2,400,000 to 3 million pounds each. While Norbergen's size may be incorrect, his weight is probably closer to the truth. Even conservative estimates say that the stones weigh at least 750 tons each, which would be 1.5 million pounds. It is an amazing feat of construction, for the blocks have been raised more than 20 feet in order to lie on top of smaller blocks. The colossal stones are fitted together perfectly, and not even a knife blade can be fitted between them. Even the blocks on the level below the trilithons are incredibly heavy. At 13 feet in length, they probably weigh about 50 tons each, an extremely large-sized bunch of stones by any other estimate, except when compared to the trilithons. Yet even the trilithons are not the largest of the stones. The largest hewn block, 13 feet by 14 feet and nearly 70 feet long, and weighing at least 1,000 tons. Both Norbergen and Berlitz give the weight of this stone at 2,000 tons. Lies in the nearby quarry, which is half a mile away. 1,000 tons is an incredible 2 million pounds. The stone is called Hadjar el Guble, Arabic for Stone of the South. Norbergen is correct in saying that there is no crane in the world that could lift any of these stones, no matter what their actual weight is. The largest cranes in the world are stationary cranes constructed at dams to lift huge concrete blocks into place. They can typically lift weights up to several hundred tons. 1,000 tons, and, God forbid, 2,000 tons are far beyond their capacity. How these blocks were moved and raised into position is beyond the comprehension of engineers. Large numbers of pilgrims came from Mesopotamia as well as the Nile Valley to the temple of Baal Astarte. The site is mentioned in the Bible in the Book of Kings. There is a vast underground network of passages beneath the Acropolis. Their function is unknown, but they were possibly used to shelter pilgrims, probably at a later period. Who built the massive platform of Baalbek? How did they do it? According to ancient Arab writings, the first Baal Astarte temple, including the massive stone blocks, was built a short time after the flood, at the order of the legendary King Nimrod, by a tribe of giants. But it could be older, because history shows that some rulers liked to claim monuments that were built by others. The mythical King Nimrod, a figure so old in history that he is lost to us, may have been laying claim to the stones of Baalbek circa 6000 BC, when the building itself had been constructed in 12,000 BC or more, before the flood. Ancient astronaut theorists have frequently suggested that Baalbek was built by extraterrestrials. Charles Berlitz says that a Soviet scientist named Dr. Agrest suggests that the stones were originally part of a landing and takeoff platform for extraterrestrial spacecraft. Author and Sumerian scholar Zechariah Sitchin believes, in a like manner, that Baalbek is a launching pad for rockets. Like Buddha seeking the middle path, I seek a middle ground in this intriguing mystery of the past. While ancient astronauts may well have visited Earth in the past, it seems unlikely that they would have arrived here in rockets. They would have mastered the art of anti-gravity, and their spaceships would be electric solid-state models, at the very least. Such aircraft could land and take off in a pleasant grassy field, and would not need a gigantic platform. What then was Baalbek, and who built it? The theory of Baalbek being some remnant of the Osirian Empire, along with some of the other megalithic sites in the Mediterranean, fits in well with the Arab legend mentioned previously, that the massive stone blocks were built a short time after the flood, at the order of King Nimrod. Yet even if Baalbek is a remnant from the Osirian civilization, how were such huge blocks transported and lifted? One clue is the massive block that still remains at the quarry a half-mile away. This stone was apparently meant to take its place on the platform with the other stones, but for some reason never made it to the site. According to the Info article, the largest stones used in the Great Pyramid of Egypt only weigh about 400,000 pounds. These are several large granite blocks in the interior of the pyramid. The authors point out that until NASA moved the gigantic Saturn V rocket to its launch pad on a huge tracked vehicle, no man had transported such a weight as the blocks at Baalbek. In his book, Baalbek, archaeologist Friedrich Raget attempts to explain how Baalbek was built and how the stones were moved into place. Explaining Baalbek is no easy task, Raget admits, but he does his best. Raget first explains that there are two quarries, one about 2 kilometers north of Baalbek, and a closer quarry, where the largest stone block in the world still lies. He then makes this interesting remark about the quarries. After the block was separated on its vertical side, a groove was cut along its outer base, and the piece was felled like a tree onto a layer of earth by means of wedging action from behind. It seems that the Romans also employed a sort of quarrying machine. This we can deduce from the pattern of concentric circular blows shown on some blocks. They are bigger than any man could have produced manually, and we can assume that the cutting tool was fixed to an adjustable lever which would hit the block with great force. Swinging radii of up to 4 meters, 13 feet, have been observed. Raguet goes on to theorize that moving an 800-ton stone on rollers would be possible. If we assume that the block rested on neatly cut cylindrical timber rollers of 30 centimeters, 12 inches diameter, at half-meter distances, each roller would carry 20 tons. If the contact surface of the roller with the ground were 10 centimeters, 4 inches wide, the pressure would be 5 kilograms per square centimeter, 71 pounds per square inch, which requires a solid stone paving on the ramp. The theoretical force necessary to move that block horizontally would be 80 tons. Another possibility is that the whole block was encased in a cylindrical wrapping of timber and iron braces. Raguet dismisses this second idea as unlikely and cumbersome. Also, there remains the question of how the block would have been unwrapped and put in place, which brings us to the even more perplexing problem of lifting great weights. There is, however, no evidence of an ancient road, which would have to have been paved, says Raguet. According to the info article, one sees no evidence of a road connecting the quarry and temple. Even if a road existed, logs employed as rollers would have been crushed to a pulp. But obviously, someone way back then knew how to transport million-pound stones. There is not a contractor today that would attempt to move or lift these stones. It is simply beyond our modern machine technology. I find it interesting that there is no discernible road between the quarry and the massive Sun Temple. This indicates one or both of two possibilities. The building of the lower platform occurred at such an ancient time in antiquity that the road is long gone, or a road was never needed for transporting the block. As the info article points out, a road would have been of little use anyway. Raguet cannot solve the problem of lifting such a block into place, saying that it is impossible to lift a huge block such as this completely off the ground by the use of levers. He says that we know that the stone had to be lifted so that the log rollers could be removed from underneath the block and then the block lowered into place. In order to fit perfectly, the stone probably had to be lifted and lowered into place several times at least. His suggestion is that a giant lifting frame was built around the block, and then at least 160 Lewis stones, wedge-shaped keystones with metal loops, were inserted into the top of the block. Then a system of pulleys and tackles were used with thousands of manual workers to raise and lower the gigantic blocks a few inches. Raguet makes no suggestion as to why the Romans, or anyone else, would go to such immense trouble, attempting a virtually impossible engineering feat in order to lay the foundation for a temple to Jupiter. If they had cut the stone into, say, 100 pieces, they would still be of unusually large size, larger than a man, but at least could have been stacked into a wall much more easily. One is left with the unsettling thought that the reason they used these huge stones was because they could use them, and do it relatively easily, though today we have no idea how. Raguet makes one final interesting comment on Baalbek. The real mystery of Baalbek is the total absence of written records on its construction. Which emperor would not have wanted to share the fame of its creation? Which architect would not have thought of proudly inscribing his name in one of the countless blocks of stone? Yet nobody lays claim to the temples. It is as if Heliopolitan Jupiter alone takes all the credit. Osirian remains in Egypt. Other vestiges of Osiris still exist in the eastern Mediterranean. The foundation ashlars of the Wailing Wall at Jerusalem are also gigantic blocks said to be similar to those at Baalbek. Megalithic ruins found under water at Alexandria, Egypt, are also believed to predate the dynastic Egypt of the pharaohs. It is from the legend of Osiris and the many tombs of Osiris that we get the name for this lost civilization from the time of Atlantis. The submerged megalithic ruins at Alexandria are another clue to ancient Osiris. Alexandria is not really an Egyptian city. It is Greek. As one might easily guess, Alexandria is named after Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who first conquered the city-states of Greece in the 3rd century B.C., and then set out to conquer the rest of the world, starting with Persia. Persia was Egypt's traditional enemy, and so Egypt fell willingly into Alexander's hands. He went to Memphis, near modern-day Cairo, and then descended the Nile to the small Egyptian town of Rakotis. Here he ordered his architects to build a great port city, what was to be Alexandria. Alexander then went to the temple of Ammon in the Siwa oasis, where he was hailed as the reincarnation of a god, which is to say, some great figure from ancient Osiris or Atlantis. Which god? We do not know. He hurried on to conquer the rest of Persia and then India. 8 years after leaving Alexandria, he returned to it in a coffin. He never saw the city, though his bones are said to rest there to this day, though no one has ever found the tomb. Of all the mysteries of Alexandria, however, none is more intriguing than the megalithic ruins which lie to the west of the Pharos lighthouse near the promontory of Ras El Tin. Discovered at the turn of the last century by the French archaeologist M. Jondet, and discussed in his paper Les ports submergés de l'ancienne île de Pharos, the prehistoric port is a large section of massive stones that today is completely submerged. Near it was the legendary Temple of Poseidon, a building now lost but known to us in literature. The Theosophical Society, upon learning of the submerged harbor of megaliths, quickly ascribed it to Atlantis. M. Jondet theorized that it might be of Minoan origin, part of a port for Cretan ships. E. M. Forster theorizes, in his excellent Guide to Alexandria, that it may be of ancient Egyptian origin, built by Ramses II circa 1300 B.C. Most of it lies in 4 to 25 feet of water and stretches for 70 yards from east to west, curving slightly to the south. Probably the true origin of the massive submerged harbor, which was definitely at least partially above water at one time, is a blend of M. Jondet's theory of Minoan builders and the Theosophical Society's belief that it is from Atlantis. In theory, with the Mediterranean slowly filling up with water, the sea would have stabilized after a few hundred years, and then the remnants of the Osirians, using a technology and science similar to that of Atlantis, built what structures and ports they could. Later, in another tectonic shift, the port area, probably used by pre-dynastic Egyptians, was submerged, and was then essentially useless. It is interesting to note, with regard to this theory, that a temple to Poseidon was located at the tip of Ras El Tin. Atlantis was known to the ancients as Poseid, and Poseidonis, or Poseidon, was a legendary king of Atlantis. Similarly, Poseidonis and Osiris are thought to be the same person. The main temple at Rakotis, the Egyptian town which Alexander found at the ancient harbor, was naturally dedicated to Osiris. What we are learning about the megalithic masterminds is that their buildings occur all over the world, and many of them are under water and difficult to reach. The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of profound truth may be another profound truth. Niels Bohr. The Sunken Temples of Karnak. Located on the south coast of Brittany, France, the site of Karnak holds the greatest concentration of megaliths in the world. Conservative estimates claim that megaliths were being erected here by 5000 B.C., nearly 7,000 years ago. They may be much older. The Grand Menhir Brisé at Ergra, Brittany, is said to be the largest menhir in the world, and is situated on a promontory near the water. The problems of moving such a huge stone are illustrated in an article published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy, entitled The Astronomical Significance of the Large Karnak Menhirs. The astronomers, Mr. and Mrs. Thom, maintain that the megalith was a lunar sighting stone. They write, "Air Gras, or the stone of the fairies, sometimes known as Le Grand Menhir Brisé, is now broken in 4 pieces, which, when measured, show that the total length must have been at least 67 feet. From its cubic content, it is estimated to weigh over 340 tons. Hull thinks it came from the Côte Sauvage on the west coast of the Quiberon Peninsula. His suggestion that it was brought round by sea takes no account of the fact that the sea level relative to this coast was definitely lower in megalithic times. Neither does he take account of the fact that a raft of solid timber, about 100 by 50 by 4 feet, would be necessary, with the menhir submerged. It is not clear how such a raft could be controlled, or indeed moved in the tidal waters round the peninsula. Assuming that the stone came by land, a prepared track of timber must have been made for the large rollers necessary and a pull of perhaps 50 tons applied. How? On the level, unless indeed the rollers were rotated by levers. It took perhaps decades of work, and yet there it lies, a mute reminder of the skill, energy, and determination of the engineers who erected it more than 3,000 years ago. In Britain we find that the tallest stones are usually lunar backsites, but there seems no need to use a stone of this size as a backsite. If, on the other hand, it was a foresight, the reason for its position and height becomes clear, especially if it was intended as a universal foresight to be used from several directions. There are 8 main values to consider, corresponding to the rising and setting of the moon at the standstills when the declination was plus or minus. It has now been shown that there is at least one site on each of the 8 lines, which has the necessary room for side movement. We must now try to think of how a position was found for Air Gras which would have satisfied the requirements. Increasingly careful observations of the moon had probably been made for hundreds of years. These would have revealed unexplained anomalies due to variations in parallax and refraction, and so it may have been considered necessary to observe at the major and minor standstills at both rising and setting. At each standstill there were 10 or 12 lunations, when the monthly declination maximum and minimum could be used. At each maximum or minimum, parties would be out at all possible places, trying to see the moon rise or set behind high trial poles. At night these poles would have needed torches at the tops, because any other marks would not be visible until actually silhouetted on the moon's disk. Meantime, some earlier existing observatory must have been in use, so that erectors could be kept informed about the kind of maximum which was being observed. They would need to know the state of the perturbation. Then there would ensue the 9 years of waiting till the next standstill, when the other 4 sites were being sought. The magnitude of the task was enhanced by the decision to make the same foresight serve both standstills. We can understand why this was considered necessary when we think of the decades of work involved in cutting, shaping, transporting, and erecting one suitable foresight. It is evident that whereas some of the sites, such as Quiberon, used the top of the foresight of Air Gras, others, such as Queyron, used the lower portion. This probably militated against the use of a mound with a smaller menhir on the top. Much has rightly been written about the labor of putting Air Gras in position, but a full consideration of the labor of finding the site shows that this may have been a comparable task. We now know that for a stone 60 feet high the sighting is perfect. We do not know that all the backsites were completed, but the fact that we have not yet found any trace of a sector to the east does not prove that the eastern sites were not used, because the stones may have been removed. Perhaps the extrapolation was done by the simpler triangle method, or perhaps it was done at a central site, like Petit Menec. Francis Hitching in Earth Magic also agrees that this was a central sighting megalith for sighting moonrises and moonsets. Much of this gigantic astronomical observatory is probably under water. Many of the megaliths along the Brittany coast are apparently submerged. Many famous sites actually lead into the water, and some megaliths can be seen at low tide, when they are barely above the surface. Many of the long lines of standing stones at Karnak and around the Morbihan Gulf were apparently built when the geography of Brittany was quite different. Near the town of Karnak is the famous alignment of hundreds of standing stones. They, too, are apparently part of some huge astronomical observatory. In another article by the Toms entitled The Karnak Alignments for the Journal for the History of Astronomy, they conclude that Karnak is also a lunar observatory of vast proportions. Say the Toms about the Menek alignments at Karnak: "A remarkable feature is the great accuracy of measurement with which the rows were set out. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that the precision was far greater than could have been achieved by using ropes. The only alternative available to the erectors was to use 2 measuring rods, of oak or whalebone. These were probably 6.802 feet long, shaped on the ends to reduce the error produced by malalignment. Each rod would be rigidly supported to be level, but we can only surmise how the engineers dealt with the inevitable steps when the ground was not level. It may be noted that the value for the megalithic yard found in Britain is 2.720 plus or minus 0.003 feet, and that found above is 2.721 plus or minus 0.001 feet. Such accuracy is today attained only by trained surveyors using good modern equipment. How then did megalithic man not only achieve it in one district, but carry the unit to other districts separated by greater distances? How was the unit taken, for example, northwards to the Orkney Islands? Certainly not by making copies of copies of copies. There must have been some apparatus for standardizing the rods, which almost certainly were issued from a controlling, or at least advising, center. The Toms see Karnak as part of an ancient and huge system that was used over much of Europe. In their article they conclude, "The organization and administration necessary to build the Breton alignments and erect their gras obviously spread over a wide area, but the evidence of the measurements shows that a very much wider area was in close contact with the central control. The geometry of the 2 egg-shaped cromlechs at Le Menec is identical with that found in British sites. The apices of triangles with integral sides forming the centers for arcs with integral radii are features in common, and on both sides of the channel the perimeters are multiples of the rod. The extensive nature of the sites in Brittany may suggest that this was the main center. But we must not lose sight of the fact that so far none of the Breton sites examined has a geometry comparable with that found at Avebury in complication of design or in difficulty of layout. It has been shown elsewhere that the divergent stone rows in Caithness could have been used as ancillary equipment for lunar observations, and in our former paper we have seen that the Petit Menec and Saint-Pierre sites were probably used in the same way. The Toms confess at the end of their article, "We do not know how the main Karnak alignments were used." Karnak likens itself to the important Egyptian temple of Karnak. The Egyptian Karnak is a huge building, which also has long rows of megalithic columns, which once supported a huge roof. Are there other even larger menhirs under the water near Karnak? One example of a known submerged megalithic structure is the covered alleyway of Kernik in the district of Plouescat, Finistère, now submerged at high tide. The amazing megaliths of the Andes. At a leveling off of a hill overlooking the Cuzco Valley in Peru is a colossal fortress called Sacsayhuamán, one of the most imposing edifices ever constructed. Sacsayhuamán consists of 3 or 4 terraced walls going up the hill, and the ruins include doorways, staircases, and ramps. Gigantic blocks of stone, some weighing more than 200 tons, 400,000 pounds, are fitted together perfectly. The enormous stone blocks are cut, faced, and fitted so well that even today one cannot slip the blade of a knife or even a piece of paper between them. No mortar are used, and no 2 blocks are alike. Yet they fit perfectly, and it has been said by some engineers that no modern builder, with the aid of metals and tools of the finest steel, could produce results more accurate. Each individual stone had to have been planned well in advance. A 20-ton stone, let alone one weighing 80 to 200 tons, cannot just be dropped casually into position with any hope of attaining that kind of accuracy. The stones are locked and dovetailed into position, making them earthquake-proof. Indeed, after many devastating earthquakes in the Andes over the last few hundred years, the blocks are still perfectly fitted, while the Spanish cathedral in Cuzco has been leveled twice. Even more incredibly, the blocks are not local stone, but by some reports come from quarries in Ecuador, almost 1,500 miles away. Others have located quarries a good deal closer, only 5 miles or so away. Though this fantastic fortress was supposedly built just a few hundred years ago by the Incas, they leave no record of having built it, nor does it figure in any of their legends. How is it that the Incas, who reportedly had no knowledge of higher mathematics, no written language, no iron tools, and did not even use the wheel, are credited with having built this cyclopean complex of walls and buildings? Frankly, one must literally grope for an explanation, and it is not an easy one. When the Spaniards first arrived in Cuzco and saw these structures, they thought that they had been built by the devil himself because of their enormity. Indeed, nowhere else can you see such large blocks placed together so perfectly. I have traveled all over the world searching for ancient mysteries and lost cities, but I had never in my life seen anything like this. The builders of the stoneworks were not merely good stonemasons. They were beyond compare. Similar stoneworks can be seen throughout the Cuzco Valley. These are usually made up of finely cut rectangular blocks of stone weighing up to perhaps a ton. A group of strong people could lift a block and put it in place. This is undoubtedly how some of the smaller structures were put together. But in Sacsayhuamán, Cuzco, and other ancient Inca cities, one can see gigantic blocks cut with 30 or more angles on each one. At the time of the Spanish conquest, Cuzco was at its peak, with perhaps 100,000 Inca subjects living in the ancient city. The fortress of Sacsayhuamán could hold the entire population within its walls in case of war or natural catastrophe. Some historians have stated that the fortress was built a few years before the Spanish invasion, and that the Incas take credit for the structure. But the Incas could not recall exactly how or when it was built. Only one early account survives of the hauling of the stones, found in Garcilaso de la Vega's The Incas. In his commentaries, Garcilaso tells of one monstrous stone brought to Sacsayhuamán from beyond Ollantaytambo, a distance of about 45 miles. The Indians say that, owing to the great labor of being brought on its way, the stone became weary and wept tears of blood because it could not attain to a place in the edifice. The historical reality is reported by the Amautas, philosophers and doctors of the Incas, who used to tell about it. They say that more than 20,000 Indians brought the stone to the site, dragging it with huge ropes. The route over which they brought the stone was very rough. There were many high hills to ascend and descend. About half the Indians pulled the stone by means of ropes placed in front. The other half held the stone from the rear, due to fears that the stone might break loose and roll down the mountains into a ravine, from which it could not be removed. On one of these hills, due to lack of caution and coordination of effort, the massive weight of the stone overcame some who sustained it from below. The stone rolled right down the hillside, killing 3,000 or 4,000 Indians who had been guiding it. Despite this misfortune, they succeeded in raising it up again. It was placed on the plain where it now rests. Even though Garcilaso describes the hauling of one stone, many doubt the truth of this story. This stone was not part of the Sacsayhuamán fortress, and is smaller than most used there, according to some researchers, although the stone has never been positively identified. Even if the story is true, the Incas may have been trying to duplicate what they supposed was the construction technique used by the ancient builders. While there is no denying that the Incas were master craftsmen, if one credits this tale, one would have to wonder how they would have transported and placed the 100-ton blocks so perfectly, given the trouble they had with only one stone. That the Incas actually found these megalithic ruins and then built on top of them, claiming them as their own, is not a particularly alarming theory. In fact, it is most probably the truth. It was a common practice in ancient Egypt for rulers to claim previously existing obelisks, pyramids, and other structures as their own, often literally erasing the cartouche of the real builder and substituting theirs. Indeed, the Great Pyramid itself would seem a victim of such a ruse. The pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops as he was known in Greek, had his cartouche chiseled into the Great Pyramid at its base. This is the only writing to be found anywhere on the pyramid, but every indication is that the pyramid was not built by Cheops. It may not have ever been meant to be a tomb, but that is another story. If the Incas came along and found walls and basic foundations of cities already in existence, why not just move in? Even today, all one needs to do is a little repair work and add a roof on some of the structures to make them habitable. Indeed, there is considerable evidence that the Incas merely found the structures and added to them. There are numerous legends that exist in the Andes that Sacsayhuamán, Machu Picchu, Tiahuanaco, and other megalithic remains were built by a race of giants. Alain Gerbrand comments in his footnotes to de la Vega's book, "3 kinds of stone were used to build the fortress of Sacsayhuamán. 2 of them, including those which provided the gigantic blocks for the outer wall, were found practically on the spot. Only the 3rd kind of stone, black andesite, for the inside buildings, was brought from relatively distant quarries. The nearest quarries of black andesite were at Huacoto and Rumicolca, 9 and 22 miles from Cuzco respectively. With regard to the giant blocks of the outer wall, there is nothing to prove that they were not simply hewn from a mass of stone existing on the spot. This would solve the mystery." Gerbrand is close in thinking that the Incas never moved those gigantic blocks in place. Yet, even if they did cut and dress the stones on the spot, fitting them together so perfectly would still require what modern engineers would call superhuman effort. Furthermore, the gigantic city of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia is similarly hewn from 100-ton blocks of stone. The quarries are many miles away, and the site is definitely of pre-Inca origin. Proponents of the theory that the Incas found these cities in the mountains and inhabited them would then say that the builders of Tiahuanaco, Sacsayhuamán, and other megalithic structures in the Cuzco area were the same people. Again quoting Garcilaso de la Vega, who wrote about these structures just after the conquest, "How can we explain the fact that these Peruvian Indians were able to split, carve, lift, carry, hoist and lower such enormous blocks of stone, which are more like pieces of a mountain than building stones, and that they accomplished this, as I said before, without the help of a single machine or instrument? An enigma such as this one cannot be easily solved without seeking the help of magic, particularly when one recalls the great familiarity of these people with devils." The Spanish dismantled as much of Sacsayhuamán as they could. When Cuzco was first conquered, Sacsayhuamán had 3 round towers at the top of the fortress, behind 3 concentric megalithic walls. These were taken apart, stone by stone, and the stones used to build new structures for the Spanish. One interesting theory about the building of the gigantic and perfectly fitted stones is that they were constructed by using a now lost technique of softening and shaping the rock. Hiram Bingham, the discoverer of Machu Picchu, wrote in his book, Across South America, of a plant he had heard of whose juices softened rock so that it could be worked into tightly fitted masonry. In his book, Exploration Fawcett, Colonel Fawcett told of how he had heard that the stones were fitted together by means of a liquid that softened stone to the consistency of clay. Brian Fawcett, who edited his father's book, tells the following story in the footnotes. A friend of his, who worked at a mining camp at 14,000 feet at Cerro de Pasco in central Peru, discovered a jar in an Incan or pre-Incan grave. He opened the jar, thinking it was chicha, an alcoholic drink, breaking the still intact ancient wax seal. Later the jar was accidentally knocked over onto a rock. Quotes Fawcett, "About 10 minutes later I bent over the rock and casually examined the pool of spilled liquid. It was no longer liquid. The whole patch where it had been and the rock under it were as soft as wet cement. It was as though the stone had melted, like wax under the influence of heat." Fawcett seemed to think that the plant might be found on the Pirene River in the Chuncho country of Peru, and described it as having dark reddish leaves and being about a foot high. Another story is mentioned of a biologist observing an unfamiliar bird in the Amazon. He watched it making a nest on a rock face by rubbing the rock with a twig. The sap of the twig dissolved the rock, making a hollow in which the bird could make its nest. All of this speculation may be put to rest by more recent findings, reported in Scientific American. In a fascinating article, a French researcher, Jean-Pierre Protzen, relates his experiments in duplicating the construction of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. Protzen spent many months around Cusco experimenting with different methods of shaping and fitting the same kinds of stones used by the Incas, or their megalithic predecessors. He found that quarrying and dressing the stones could be accomplished using the stone hammers found in abundance in the area. The precision fitting of stones was a relatively simple matter, he says. He pounded out the concave depressions into which new stones were fitted by trial and error, until he achieved a snug fit. This meant continually lifting and placing the stones together and chipping at them a little at a time. This process is very time-consuming, but it's simple and it works. Yet even for Protzen, some mysteries remain. He was not able to figure out how the builders handled the larger stones. The fitting process necessitated the repeated lowering and raising of the stone being fitted, with trial and error pounding in between. He does not know just how 100-ton stones were manipulated at this stage, and some stones are actually far heavier. According to Protzen, to transport the stones from the quarries, special access roads and ramps were built. Many of the stones were dragged over gravel-covered roads, which in his theory gave the stones their polished surfaces. The largest stone at Ollantaytambo weighs about 150 tons. It could have been pulled up a ramp with a force of about 260,000 pounds, he says. Such a feat would have required a minimum of some 2,400 men. Getting the men seemed possible, but where did they all stand? Protzen says that the ramps were only 8 meters wide at most. Further perplexing Protzen is that the stones of Sacsayhuaman were finely dressed, yet are not polished, showing no signs of dragging. He could not figure out how they were transported the 22 miles from the Rumicolca quarry. Protzen's article reflects good research and points out that modern science still cannot explain or duplicate the building feats found at both Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. Continually lifting and chipping away at a 100-ton stone block to make it fit perfectly is just too great of an engineering task to have been practical. Protzen's theory would work well on the smaller, precisely square, later construction, but fails with the older megalithic construction beneath. Perhaps the theories of levitation and softening stones cannot be discarded yet. One last intriguing observation which Protzen makes is that the cutting marks found on some of the stones are very similar to those found on the pyramidion of an unfinished obelisk at Aswan in Egypt. Is this a coincidence, or was there an ancient civilization with links to both sites? Most scientists are bottle washers and button sorters. Robert Heinlein. The world's largest computer. The magnificent monument in England called Stonehenge sits alone on the Salisbury Plain, flanked by a parking lot and gift shop for tourists. It is famous for its large stones and curious architecture, a circle of massive, well-cut stones. In 1964, the British astronomer Gerald S. Hawkins first published his now famous treatise on Stonehenge as an astronomical computer. His article, entitled Stonehenge, a Neolithic Computer, appeared in issue 202 of the prestigious British journal Nature. In 1965, Hawkins's famous book Stonehenge Decoded was published. Hawkins upset the archaeological world by claiming that the megalithic site was not just a circular temple erected by some egocentric kings, but rather a sophisticated computer for observing the heavens. He begins his Nature article with a quote from Diodorus on prehistoric Britain from his History of the Ancient World, written about 50 B.C. "The moon, as viewed from this island, appears to be but a little distance from the earth, and to have on it prominences like those of the earth, which are visible to the eye. The account is also given that the god, moon, visits the island every 19 years, the period in which the return of the stars to the same place in the heavens is accomplished. There is also on the island both a magnificent sacred precinct of Apollo, sun, and a notable temple, and the supervisors are called Boreadae, and succession to these positions is always kept in their family." Hawkins's basic theory was that Stonehenge was an observatory. The impartial mathematics of probability and the celestial sphere are on my side. Hawkins's first contention was that alignments between pairs of stones and other features, calculated with a computer from small-scale plans, compared their directions with the azimuths of the rising and setting sun and moon, at the solstices and equinoxes calculated for 1500 B.C. Hawkins claimed to have found 32 significant alignments. His second contention was that the 56 Aubrey holes were used as a computer, that is, as tally marks, for predicting movements of the moon and eclipses, for which he claims to have established a hitherto unrecognized 56-year cycle with 15% irregularity, and that the rising of the full moon nearest the winter solstice over the heel stone always successfully predicted an eclipse. It is interesting to note that no more than half these eclipses were visible from Stonehenge. Says Hawkins in Stonehenge Decoded, "The number 56 is of great significance for Stonehenge because it is the number of Aubrey holes set around the outer circle. Viewed from the center, these holes are placed at equal spacings of azimuth around the horizon, and therefore they cannot mark the sun, moon, or any celestial object. This is confirmed by the archaeologists' evidence. The holes have held fires and cremations of bodies, but have never held stones. Now, if the Stonehenge people desired to divide up the circle, why did they not make 64 holes simply by bisecting segments of the circle? 32, 16, 8, 4, and 2. I believe that the Aubrey holes provided a system for counting the years, 1 hole for each year, to aid in predicting the movement of the moon. Perhaps cremations were performed in a particular Aubrey hole during the course of the year, or perhaps the hole was marked by a movable stone. Stonehenge can be used as a digital computing machine. The stones at hole 56 predict the year when an eclipse of the sun or moon will occur within 15 days of midwinter, the month of the winter moon. It will also predict eclipses for the summer moon." The critics of Hawkins, the ruling academic minds of their time, immediately jumped on his discoveries and denounced them. In 1966, an article by the British astronomer R.J. Atkinson appeared in Nature, entitled Decoder Misled?, in which Atkinson criticized Hawkins for many of his statements about Stonehenge being an astronomical computer. Said Atkinson of Hawkins's book Stonehenge Decoded, "It is tendentious, arrogant, slipshod, and unconvincing, and does little to advance our understanding of Stonehenge. The first 5 chapters on the legendary and archaeological background have been uncritically compiled and contain a number of bizarre interpretations and errors. The rest of the book is an unsuccessful attempt to substantiate the author's claim that Stonehenge was an observatory. The impartial mathematics of probability and the celestial sphere are on my side." Of his 2 main contentions, the first concerns alignments between pairs of stones and other features, calculated with a computer from small-scale plans ill-adapted for this purpose. Atkinson's scathing criticism of Hawkins is revealing, because it shows how resistant to new ideas established academics can be. Atkinson's reluctance to believe that Stonehenge was some sort of astronomical computer is probably largely due to the popular belief that ancient man simply didn't have a state of civilization that allowed him to pursue such topics of higher knowledge. But these critics are heard from no more, and there seems little doubt to even the most conservative archaeologist that Stonehenge is some sort of astronomical temple. There are a number of simple astronomical truths that can be discerned from Stonehenge. For instance, there are 29.53 days between full moons, and there are 29.5 monoliths in the outer Sarsen circle. There are 19 of the huge blue stones in the inner horseshoe, which has several possible explanations and uses. There are nearly 19 years between the extreme rising and setting points of the moon. Also, if a full moon occurs on a particular day of the year, say on the summer solstice, it is 19 years before another full moon occurs on the same day of the year. Finally, there are 19 eclipse years, or 223 full moons, between similar eclipses, such as an eclipse that occurs when the sun, moon, and earth return to their same relative positions. Other planets' positions may vary in even larger cycles. It is also suggested that the 5 large trilithon archways represent the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The British writer on antiquities, John Ivamy, makes a stirring suggestion at the end of his popular book on Stonehenge, The Sphinx and the Megaliths. He spends the bulk of the book trying to prove his thesis that Stonehenge was built by a group of adventurous Egyptians who were sent to the British Isles to establish a series of astronomical sites at higher latitudes in order to accurately predict solar eclipses, which the observatories in Egypt could not do because they were too close to the equator. Ivamy gives such evidence as the megalithic construction, key stone cuts in the gigantic blocks of stone, the obvious astronomical purpose, and most of all the use of a numbering system that is based on the number 6 rather than the number 10 as we use today. Ivamy shows that the Egyptians used a numbering system based on the number 6, and that Stonehenge was built using the same system. He then suggests that the Mormons used a number system based on 6 when building their temples, especially the Great Temple in Salt Lake City. In the end, Ivamy's thesis is quite controversial. He believes that Brigham Young and the original Mormon settlers in Utah are the reincarnation of the same Egyptian group of settlers who were sent to Britain to build Stonehenge. Says Ivamy, "Reference has already been made to the vast wooden dome, built entirely without metal, that roofs the Mormon tabernacle. Could its construction have been inspired by a dim recollection of how the same people, in another incarnation some centuries earlier, had built a dome over what had then become the Temple of Hyperborean Apollo? It is a fascinating idea that the Egyptians came to Britain to build a megalithic observatory to accurately predict lunar eclipses. It is recorded that about 2000 B.C., a Chinese emperor put to death his 2 chief astronomers for failing to predict an eclipse of the sun. Asks ancient astronaut theorist Raymond Drake, "Today, would any king care?" The Egyptians, Chinese, Mayans, and many other ancient cultures were obsessed with eclipses, as well as other planetary solar phenomena. It is believed that they associated catastrophes, including the sinking of Atlantis, with planetary movements and eclipses. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians, Mayans, and other civilizations thought they could predict the next cataclysm by monitoring lunar eclipses and the positions of the planets in relation to the Earth. Herodotus writes about ancient Egyptian astronomy and cataclysms in Book 2, Chapter 142. "Thus far the Egyptians and their priests told the story, and they showed that there had been 341 generations of men, from the first king unto this last, the priest of Hephaestus. Now in all this time, 11,340 years, they said that the sun had removed from his proper course 4 times, and had risen where he now setteth, and set where he now riseth. But nothing in Egypt was altered thereby, neither as touching the river, nor as touching the fruits of the earth, nor concerning sicknesses or deaths. If Herodotus is to be believed, then the earth has shifted around its axis in what is called a pole shift. The sun then appears to rise in a different direction from normal. Pole shifts are accompanied by a wide variety of devastating earth changes and severe weather phenomena. Therefore, if the Egyptians were familiar with this sort of occurrence, and having been thus far unaffected by the cataclysm, they may well have gone to great length to improve their astronomical knowledge, including the colonization of England and the building of Stonehenge. Indeed, the megalithic masterminds virtually colonized the world, from Egypt to England to the Americas, Easter Island, and Tonga. Megaliths exist in such remote places as Manchuria, the Philippines, Mongolia, and the Assam hills of northeast India. The megalithic masterminds were once everywhere. Yet, what was the technology that these master builders used?